Oh, oh.
NT teacher?
Yes, sir.
Okay, teacher.
Amrita. Amrita-Darshini. Amrita. Krishnanuni.
Teacher
Okay.
Start here.
Okay. So first of all, I would like to welcome all of you to this seminar. I am very happy to see the wonderful turnout in this evening for the 49th webinar organized by KUCT Nirvangar. Also, for all the program, we need the blessings of God. So let me welcome Aishwarya Raj from English Optional for the prayer song.
Dewa Karunya Sindha Namikkunu Njangal Karalinte Pulkal Nin Padatharil Kanikka vechu Namikkunu Njangal Kanikka vechu Namikkunu Njangal Loka Samasta Sukhino Bhavantu Ee Mandrame Lokamellam Murna Vijnana Deepam Nirakadirtuka Nerinde Padatili Deva Nerinde Padatili Deva Kanaya Lokam Kakunna Deva Karunya Sindha Namikkunu Njangal.
Thank you, Aishwarya. So let me welcome the huge crowd assembled here, joined today for the 49th webinar, Introduction to Micro Teaching. So first, let me welcome our principal, Dr. Sunit Kumar Jian, who is the inspiration and motivation behind all this organization of such webinars. So welcome you, sir, to this webinar.
Thank you, teacher.
So it's my great honor and privilege to welcome and introduce the resource person for today's webinar, Introduction to Micro Teaching, Dr. Velayudhan Nair T, Assistant Professor of English at Peet Memorial Training College, Mavelikkara. It's so impossible to mention sir's achievement as he has a lot into his credit. He has received many national, international awards, and also he has so many books and publication into his credit. And in one word, if we are introducing him, he is a ready reference for the novice teachers who is stepping into the teaching profession. So with great pleasure and pride, I am welcoming Dr. Velayudhan Nair sir for this webinar. So welcome, sir.
Thank you so much, teacher. Thank you.
So Let me welcome the other participants, student teachers, teacher educators, and my colleagues, and all my dear students who are joined here today for the webinar. So welcome you all to this webinar once again. And sir, I think we can start the session.
All right. Is my screen visible?
Yes, sir, we can see.
All right. Good evening, KUCT Nedbangad, and very special regards to Dr. Sumit Kumar, Principal, who has been a very dear friend of mine since a long, long time. And special regards to Nitya ma'am, who invited me over to this event. I also see Chanchal ma'am sitting somewhere over there. So hello to you, ma'am. And Aishwarya, what a beautiful prayer. Thank you for that. And hello to all students who have chosen to be here with us today. In fact, micro teaching is probably one of the simplest topics that you will learn this semester. And it also happens to be one of the most important ones. I know you must be dead exhausted from a very hard day at college. Some of you might have spent your entire day online listening to online classes. So I assure you, I won't take long. I mean, like if things go as per schedule, I should be able to wind this up in say around 45-50 minutes. And then probably we could leave the session open to questions or discussions if you have any. I would also really appreciate it if you could have a piece of paper or a pencil handy and ready by your side, because we'd be doing some self-assessment ratings very soon. So please be ready for that. Nothing to be scared of, by the way, simple. All right. I believe the very best way to begin any discussion for that matter is by presenting a very random thought before the participants. And this is the thought that I have before you today. I'm actually talking about a subject expert here, and I believe that most of us who are here today are either language experts or aspiring language experts. We are either language teachers or aspiring language teachers. So this is a quote that I have before you today. The expert in anything was once a beginner. Now, based on your linguistic expertise, how would you rate yourself as a language teacher? I mean, would you rate yourself as a beginner? Would you rate yourself as an expert? Or would you rate yourself as occupying a space somewhere between these two extremes? So if you have that piece of paper with you, just take down that pencil and note it down somewhere. Don't worry, I'm not going to ask you for that paper or anything. So you can just keep the note to yourself, but just make a note there. The second thought that I want to present before you today is a very random thought again, which says all students can learn and succeed, but not in the same way and not on the same day. Now, this is a quote that points at the heterogeneous group of students that we deal with every day in our classrooms. You know, all students can learn and succeed, but not in the same way and not on the same day. We deal with groups of young people every day who are as different from each other as they possibly could be, who are absolutely different from each other with regard to their interests, their attitudes, their aptitudes, their psychological states, their physical states, and whatnot. So this is a second random thought that I want to present before you. Now, if you're talking of heterogeneity and the kind of different kinds of student populations that we are dealing with on an everyday basis in the classrooms, I would tell you that teaching is not a very easy task, is it? In fact, this is what makes teaching a very complex process. It's a very complex task. And this is what makes teaching a task that requires the teacher to have a specific set of skills. You know, and this is why every person, in fact, who has decided to become a teacher needs to ask himself or herself 10 very important questions. Let's take a look at what those questions are. The first question is, are you a good communicator? Are you good at physical communication? Are you good at verbal communication? Are you good at non-verbal communication? Are you able to establish eye contact with your students or with persons whom you're communicating with? Are you able to use enough and more gestures in your communication while you're talking to people? So rate your communication skills out of a total score of 10. For instance, if you think you're an absolutely fantastic communicator, you can rate yourself 10. And if you're not quite sure about your communication skills, then probably you can rate slightly lower down the scale. So take that piece of paper, and we're going to be doing quite a lot of rating in the next few slides. So take that piece of paper and rate yourself on a total score of 10 and keep it aside. We're going to need it soon. So are you a good communicator? Rate yourself on a scale of 1 to 10. 10 standing for excellent communication and 1 standing for mediocre communication. All right. The second question that I want to ask you is, how patient are you? Now, this is a very tricky question. Needless to say, you're going to deal with lots of students coming from different cultural backgrounds, coming from different political backgrounds, coming from different familial backgrounds with different intellectual capacities, who are used to different learning styles and so on. Again, we are dealing with a heterogeneous group here. And as a teacher, you need to be extremely patient when it comes to meeting their requirements, their demands, in dealing with their behavior, and so on and so forth. So how would you rate your patience? As a person, how patient do you think you are? On a scale of 10, would you give yourself a 10 maybe, or a 7 or 5 or even less? Note it down. Question number 3, are you a critical thinker? Now, how would you rate your critical thinking skills? I'm sure you have already discussed what critical thinking skills are in your psychology class. Are you one of those persons who always thinks outside the box? Are you one of those people who always has an alternate solution to people's problems? On a score of 10, how would you rate yourself for critical thinking? Note it down. So you have already 4 scores now, 1 for the general score that I asked you first, for the question that I asked you first, and 3 scores now. Note it down. On a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate yourself on critical thinking? How good an organizer are you? Now, some people, I believe, are born organizers, and when you hand them over a task to organize something, they can never go wrong. Actually, a whole lot of planning goes into organization, right? A whole lot of thought goes into organization. And you also need to have that ability to foresee things, both good things and bad things. And you need to be prepared for eventualities. For those things, good things and bad things, you need to be prepared for those. And if you need to be a good organizer, you need to have all these abilities and skills thrown together. So rate yourself on a scale of 10 again, based on your organizational skills, 1 to 10. Question 5 is, are you a creative thinker? So it's just not enough that you always think critically. You need to think creatively as well, because a teacher needs to be massively creative. Especially a language teacher needs to be massively creative. The teacher's creativity, in fact, can go a long way in making the classes interesting to the students. And ultimately, it's also bound to have an effect on the love that the students feel towards the subject itself. ഞാൻ എപ്പോഴും പറയാറുള്ള ഒരു ഉദാഹരണം എന്താണെന്ന് വെച്ചിട്ടുണ്ടെങ്കിൽ, ലാംഗ്വേജ് ടീച്ചേഴ്സിനെ പെട്ടെന്ന് അല്ലെങ്കിൽ ലാംഗ്വേജ് സ്റ്റുഡൻസിനെ പെട്ടെന്ന് റിലേറ്റ് ചെയ്യാൻ പറ്റുന്ന ഒരു കാര്യം എന്ന് വെച്ച് കഴിഞ്ഞാൽ, why is it that you fell in love with language somewhere in high school, and why is it that you hated math? Usually that's the case, right? All of us hate math. Most of us, at least. I do. So why is it that we ended up hating math, and why is it that we ended up loving language at some point of time in the high school? Does it have something to do with the teacher who taught us the respective subjects? So note down your self-rating, please, when it comes to creative thinking. How would you rate yourself on a scale of 1 to 10 again? Creative thinking. Question 6 is, would you make a good leader? Yeah, we are all good leaders. At least we assume ourselves to be good leaders. And by a good leader, I mean someone who takes responsibility for one's own actions, and someone who feels responsible for the whole group that he's leading, and someone who has the ability to motivate and lead a group of people towards an objective, right? So note down your self-rating, please, when it comes to your leadership skills. That was question 6. Question 7 is, do you have it in you to work in a team? Now, this is a very tricky question if you ask me, because most of us work brilliantly as individuals. But when you're thrown into a group, a lot of insecurities prop up, and Nothing is the same again. So the ability to work as a team, for instance, where your individual personality means something and your personality as a group member means something else, but you're able to sort of manage both these together. This is very, very important. So do you have that skill to work efficiently as part of a team? And if you have that skill, rate yourself on a scale of 1 to 10. Question 8 is, do you keep an eye on the clock? What about time management? When you work or when you study, for that matter, do you keep an eye on the clock always? If you are good with managing time, it means that you're good with managing stress. You experience less stress naturally, that you are able to properly carry out tasks, for instance, or that you have it also means that you have a functional schedule 24/7. You always have a schedule that works according to a time set. So how good are you at managing time? 8, 5, 4, note in there. And question 9 is, are you good with technology? Now, are you good using mobiles? Are you comfortable using laptops and tablets and desktop computers? Are you comfortable using overhead projectors or digital screens? Are you okay with experimenting with new learning software? Are you fine with the constant updation, that happens in ICT, or does it overwhelm you? Are you scared by all the updation that is going on around? Are you tech savvy or are you tech phobic? That's a question that I'm asking you. So rate yourself when it comes to your comfort with technology, again, on a scale of 1 to 10. And the last question that we need to sort of think about today is, are you good at resolving conflicts? Can you resolve conflicts? This is caught in the middle of a conflict. Suppose you're caught in the middle of a conflict. What sort of a person are you? I mean, what would you do? Would you just walk away, or would you just pretend that it never existed? Or are you the kind of person who would work out a solution in the interest of both the parties? So score yourself again. So you could sum up, in fact, all the scores that you have on your list right now. I mean, you have 10 questions. So naturally, the score should be out of 100. And there might be several people, I'm sure, among you who have scored an 80 or above, which sounds excellent. There might be people among you who have scored 60 or above, which sounds like quite a fair score to me. And there might be people among you who have scored 40 or above, or even less, which is again just a score that suggests that there's plenty of scope for improvement out there. The scores, in fact, mean nothing more than that. So of all these questions that I have asked you, probably the most important one, again, would be the very first one, the very first question. Are you a good communicator? And this is because teaching is all about communication. And the good news is that, the skills that make up the communication process in teaching could be learned. It could be practiced even, and it could be perfected. Isn't that wonderful? And this is what forms the basis of what you call micro teaching. This is what the concept of micro teaching is all about. Now, what is micro teaching? I mean, micro teaching, in fact, the term, it is just a method, very plainly stated. It's just a method of improving your teaching skills. So you have all these individual teaching skills that we have been talking about, and micro teaching is a method or a strategy that helps you improve these basic teaching skills that you have. And this is a method that was developed in Stanford University way back, several years back, 60s, for instance. It was in 63 that it was developed in the Stanford University. And D.W. Allen, Dwight W. Allen, is the propagator of the major proponent, you call it, of microteaching method. Now, what is microteaching used for? Microteaching is simply a strategy that is used to sort of brush up and improve your already existing skills, because as adult individuals, all of us, in fact, have these skills to a certain degree at least. So we need to sort of brush up and improve those skills. And it could also be used to develop new skills. It could also be used to develop new skills. So this is what microteaching is all about. Now, if you sort of just do a very random Google search, you could find any number of definitions for micro teaching. But of all the definitions, there's this one small definition of micro teaching that has been put up by B.K. Passy, one of the most renowned educators in our country. And I find this very interesting because almost all the factors that interest us regarding micro teaching have been sort of incorporated into this very simple definition that Passy sir has come up with. So I would, in fact, like to specifically draw your attention to those small bits and parts that have been marked out in green and yellow. And I'll just read it out to you, though I'm sure you can read it yourself, but still. Micro teaching is a teacher training technique that requires scaling down. Student teachers teach a single concept using specified teaching skill to a small number of students in a short duration of time. So this is what it is all about. So the focus is again on the teacher training technique. It's all about a method or a strategy or a technique that's used in teaching. And it's about scaling down. We'll be moving on to that particular term in the coming slides, but you can focus on the other bits. Like only a single concept is taught using micro teaching, and only one specific skill is focused on. And the teaching is done to a very small number of students in a very short span of time. So this is what it is all about. And probably this is the best definition of micro teaching that you'd be able to find anywhere. So what is scaling down? You must have noted that very small term, scaling down. So what is scaling down all about? Scaling down is nothing but bringing down in number, and micro teaching, everything is scaled down. Absolutely everything is scaled down. The time, in fact, is scaled down. So this is a class that lasts for barely 5 to 10 minutes, probably max 5 to 10 minutes max. So the time is scaled down. Then content is scaled down again. Now content is scaled down in the sense you don't teach an entire lesson during a micro teaching class. You take one specific concept, you take one specific idea, and then you teach it to a group of students. And the number of students again is scaled down. So usually you're used to teaching classes that are just bursting out with students, huge student groups. But in micro teaching, again, the student number is scaled down to 4 to 10 max, again, like instead of the hugely crowded classrooms, that you usually deal with in schools. So the number of students is scaled down. And finally, the skills are also scaled down. So teaching, in fact, consists of a group of skills. But when you're micro teaching, you're focusing on any one particular skill alone, and the focus is only on one skill and not on multiple skills that are usually, dealt with in the normal teaching procedure. So this is what scaling is all about, bringing down in terms of number. Then what are the 10 micro teaching skills? Let's quickly take a look at the 10 micro teaching skills that are probably most important to you, and which are probably the 10 micro teaching skills that you need to be absolutely familiar with. I mean, you should also understand that the list of micro teaching skills, in fact, keeps expanding over time. New micro teaching skills, are constantly added to the list. So what I have done is I have merely listed the 10 most important ones here. I mean, let's now analyze each of these individual skills in detail. But before we go on to the next slide, let's quickly take a look at the 10 skills. The skill of introduction, the skill of explaining, the skill of questioning, the skill of stimulus variation, the skill of reinforcement, the skill of illustration, the skill of blackboard writing, the skill of demonstration, the skill of closure, and the skill of using ICT. So we need to be familiar with each of these 10 skills. And we need to understand how a micro teaching class can be conducted with regard to each of these skills. The first one is, of course, the skill of introduction. Now, the first thing that we need to understand is that, each micro teaching skill, in fact, consists of something called skill components. Each micro teaching skill consists of something called skill components. Now, what do you mean by a skill component? Skill components are, in fact, nothing but sub-components of the skill that together make up this micro teaching skill. You will understand that when we go into the details of each of these micro teaching skills now. So teachers must possess the skill of giving students a great introduction, especially important for language teachers. In fact, before they begin teaching a lesson or a topic, the introduction that they present before the students is Absolutely important. So it's actually an art that helps engage students and tell them exactly, what they should expect from the class that's going to happen and what they should not expect. So that is what the skill of introduction is all about. How do you actually start a lesson? How do you introduce a concept to your students, whether it's a language concept or whether it's a grammatical concept or whether it's just, a concept that you have come across in your prose lesson or in a poem. So how would you introduce a concept? And if you have to introduce something, you need to understand what the student already knows, right? The previous knowledge of the students is something that is very important if you need to introduce something. So you need to dig up, the student's previous knowledge and start working from there. And you could use appropriate devices for introducing the concept to the students. You could introduce it verbally. I might speak to the students, say, for 5 minutes and introducing the concept to the students just through my language. And I might use a graphic aid, for instance. I might use a picture, or I might use a PowerPoint presentation, or I might just take them over to Netflix for that matter, and introduce them to a movie trailer if I believe that that is going to be relevant in introducing a concept. So I mean, the possibilities are just endless. So you need to maintain the continuity, and you need to sort of make relevant statements throughout. You can't possibly introduce something and then just say something that is absolutely disjointed from the introduction that you have made. So the continuity has to be continuously maintained. So this is what the skill of introduction is all about. And this is probably one of the most important micro teaching skills that we are going to deal with today. The second important micro teaching skill that we need to be familiar with is the skill of explanation. I mean, like, we are all great explainers. We have all been explaining things since, time immemorial. I mean, it is more of an intellectual activity for all of us, right? The skill of explanation, in fact. And there are lots of things that teachers keep on, there are lots of things that teachers will have to explain to students. So they'll have to explain ideas, they'll have to explain phenomena, they'll have to explain concepts. There's absolutely no end to it. So when it comes to skill components in the skill of explanation, you need to have something called a beginning statement first. So if you are going to explain something, you have something called a beginning statement. The first statement that you're going to make, that will sort of lead on to your explanation. And following the beginning statement, you have something called explaining links or explanation linkers. Explaining links, rather. These are the statements that link to the actual explanation that is going to happen. So you're explaining something, then so the actual explanation happens. And teachers could also establish relationships between concepts and ideas, and all these things that have already been explained. Teachers could explain the relationship between the newly explained concept and something that has already been explained, and so on. And finally, there are something called the concluding statements. So you have a beginning statement first, and then you have the explaining links, the actual explanation, and finally the concluding statement. The teacher might even ask a few questions at the end of the explanation session to understand if students have properly understood or not. So these are all, the subcomponents or the component skills that make up the skill of explanation. The third one is a skill of questioning. Teachers are experts in asking questions, and it's a skill that is generally used to test the understanding of students, but it could also be used to, for further purposes, like, for instance, for probing into something, to finding out, how much they know and how much they do not know, and, and to find out if something that they know is right or wrong, or, like, lots of probing questions can be asked. So it's usually used to sort of, in fact, as teachers, we need to understand that the questions that we ask are meaningful. That is what I mean by MRSPC. I mean, it's sort of an acronym for things that we need to keep in mind when you ask a question. I mean, we need to ensure that the questions that we are going to ask are meaningful. The questions need to be relevant. Absolutely relevant. The third one is questions need to be very specific. You can't just ask a very vague question, and they have to be very precise. And the last one is clear. So these are the five characteristics of, the perfectly coded question, if you ask me. I mean, you need to ensure that questions are meaningful. They need to be relevant. They need to be specific, precise, and clear. And if you're planning to ask them, make sure that the questions follow these criteria. So again, like they could be asked to sort of test the understanding of the students. They can also be used to sort of probe deeper into the subject. And you could use varied questioning styles as well. Now, what do you mean by varied questioning? You know, because sometimes, you know, you need not necessarily be always verbal when it comes to asking questions. You know, you could just be sort of ending a statement with, you know, a probing utterance like, mm-hmm, and so on and so forth. I mean, like, there are lots of options and opportunities. So that is a skill of questioning. Now, the fourth micro teaching skill is the one that probably interests me the most. It is something called the skill of stimulus variation. Now, we have all been doing we have been all been exercising the skill of stimulus variation in varied forms, you know, since a very, very long time, but not necessarily in class, but usually, you know, with friends, with family members, with teachers, with, you know, other people whom we are interacting with. We have all been using the skill of stimulus variation to a certain extent. You know, in teaching, it's a technique that is used to keep students engaged in a topic or on a lesson by suddenly changing the teacher's behavior. Now, what do you mean by teacher's behavior? I mean, like, it might be a gesture that I suddenly come up with, or see, I made a pause and you were all wondering if I had lost my audio, right? So this is what stimulation is all about. I mean, stimulus variation is all about. So you could just pause, you know, in the middle of a sentence and keep students wondering what the teacher means. And it's usually used to sort of capture the students' attention by using different kinds of stimuli in the class. We have all done this at some point of time, and we all have our own experiences of our teachers doing it at some point of time, you know. So the main elements of stimulus variation would be skills like movement, for instance. You know, if the teacher keeps still all the time, and if he doesn't even move his head, or, you know, the body or the hands or the limbs and all that, you know, it makes for a very boring class, right? So a lot of movement needs to be involved, and especially when it comes to teaching language. And gestures, of course, moving about your hands or nodding your head, and not probably as much as I do, but still you need to sort of use a little bit of gestures every now and then. What about changes in speech patterns? You know, I'm sort of talking to you at a reasonable volume right now, and then suddenly I drop my voice and start whispering to you like this. And so students are sort of, they're keen, they're curious to understand what's happening, because he's suddenly lowered his voice and he is sort of whispering to you. So then focusing might be, again, a non-verbal behavior. You're suddenly talking to a group of people and you suddenly look at one person and you start focusing on that one particular person, you know, and the entire class turns towards that person. So that again is an example of stimulus variation. Changes in interactional styles. And then oral visual switching, you know. So again, like, suddenly you have been talking to a class, say, probably for the last 15 minutes, and then suddenly you stop talking and then you show them a picture, and then you ask them to take a look at this picture for the next 10 seconds. That is oral visual switching. So there's sudden change in the stimulus, and the responses from the students also change accordingly. And finally, the pausing thing that I demonstrated you know, a few minutes back. So these are all, in fact, components of stimulus variation. And this is, again, a skill that needs to be practiced in the classroom if you need to sort of make it perfect. Micro teaching skill 5 is the skill of reinforcement. Now, reinforcement is, again, a term that should be quite familiar to you in psychology. And teachers usually use this skill, the reinforcement skill, to encourage responses from the students. You know, it's a response technique based on the concept of feedback or reinforcement. So the reinforcement that you provide to student responses could be verbal or non-verbal. Sometimes you ask a question to a class and suddenly one person puts up his hand or her hand, and, you know, the person gets up and gives you the right answer. And then you provide him or her with some verbal reinforcement. Excellent. You tell him, excellent, you know, or way to go, thumbs up, and all these things. These are all sort of verbal reinforcement, which in fact what happens to that particular person is, again, like, encouraged to respond further in the class, right? So that is verbal responses, verbal reinforcement. At the same time, there could be non-verbal responses as well. You know, an applause might be a non-verbal response, or just showing a thumbs up sign might be a non-verbal response, or, you know, rolling your eyes in approval could be a non-verbal sign again. So these are all like non-verbal signs and verbal methods, non-verbal and verbal methods of reinforcing something. And these are all positive reinforcers that I have been talking about. And there are negative reinforcers as well. But yeah, let's just focus on the positive reinforcers at the moment. So reinforcement. And then there's something called the skill of illustration. Now, by illustration, you do not really mean drawing something. By illustration, what you mean is illustrating something with examples. So at least in some very tricky situations, you reach a point. You reach a point where you have explained a concept, for instance, and you feel that it needs to be further explained. You feel that the explanation wasn't enough and that you need to further explain it with the help of examples. So that is where the skill of illustration comes in. And the examples that are formulated by you, to further explain the concept that you have already taught them, need to be very relevant. I mean, you can't just sort of, drag in any example that you like. It has to be absolutely related to the concept that you have been talking till then. And they need to be very relevant. They need to be very interesting to the students. And also they need to be absolutely simple. So these are the three factors that you can, these are the three, characteristics of a good example. I mean, absolutely relevant, absolutely simple, and absolutely interesting. So whatever examples you are bringing into the class, please make sure that, they follow these criteria. And these examples could in fact be used to explain an already explained concept even further. So in fact, you need not necessarily explain things all the time, right? Examples need not necessarily be verbal examples all the time. They could be non-verbal examples also. So I suppose like you have come up, you have in fact come across this very interesting example that in a video, for instance, that you want to present before your students that further establishes the concept that you have already taught them. So that is again a possibility. So the skill of illustration meaning illustrating with examples. The skill of blackboard writing. Now the skill of blackboard writing appears so simple actually until you put a piece of chalk between your fingers and walk onto the board and place the chalk on the board and start writing something. And it's then you realize that, it's not as simple as you had thought it to be. I mean, writing on the board is an art form that needs to be perfected to practice, so writing on the blackboard again is a micro teaching skill. And letters written on the board, for instance, if you have tried writing on the board, I mean, there might be several among you who are absolutely proficient writing on the board in straight lines, but there might also be, people among you who are not that familiar with writing on the blackboard, especially since you don't have blackboards in colleges and all these days. You're using ICT aids all the time. But when you actually use a blackboard, you need to ensure that the letters that are being written on the blackboard, are neat, and they should be of the appropriate size. They can't be too large or too small, for instance, and that, that they should be absolutely legible. So these are things that you need to sort of pay attention to. And the lines that are written on the blackboard should be in a straight line. At least some of you might have experienced writing on the blackboard, and when you finally, walk back and take a look at it, it might be just a slant starting from one corner of the board, moving across the other corner of the board. That happens as well. But again, that's a skill that, gets perfected with practice. And again, neat blackboard work is something that talks a lot of the teacher. That's what you're usually told. I mean, when we used to do our BA classes, we were told, that the teacher is going to take one look at your blackboard and he's going to identify what kind of a teacher you are. So you might have seen very scrubby blackboards. You might have seen cluttered blackboards. You might have seen absolutely blank blackboards, and there are different kinds of blackboard work that teachers keep on doing all the time. And every time a person writes something on the blackboard, it's believed that it speaks something of the personality of the teacher. So again, we need to be very careful when you're doing that scribbling on the blackboard. The skill of demonstration. Again, like not every one of us is a good demonstrator, and that's a fact. I mean, not all of us are actors for that matter, right? But language teachers in particular need to be demonstrators, and good demonstrators, because we benefit a lot from, perfecting the art of demonstration. See, if I asked you to demonstrate the look of the terrified cat that you see on the screen right now, how many of you would you be How many of you would be actually able to do that? The look of the terrified cat that you see on screen now, demonstrated in front of me. How many of you would be able to do that? I mean, all it requires is to sort of pop out your eyes like anything and sort of maintain a blank expression, on the screen. But even this is not really that easy when you're standing in front of a group of standard 9 students, who are looking at you skeptically, and who are sort of waiting for that one fatal error to fall out of your mouth. So many of us, in fact, go back on demonstrations, in fact, and what we do is we try to opt for other simpler choices that we have at hand. Like, for instance, എന്തിനാണ് ഞാൻ അഭിനയിച്ച് സ്വയം പിള്ളേരുടെ മുന്നേ ഒരു ഫൂൾ ആവുന്നതെന്നൊക്കെ വിചാരിച്ച് നമ്മൾ പലപ്പോഴും we don't sort of demonstrate things. I used to remember, like, I used to have a student years back, and she was teaching the word crouch, CROUCH, which is a simple word which means കുനിഞ്ഞു കൂടിയിരിക്കുക എന്നുള്ള അർത്ഥത്തിലുള്ള ഒരു സിമ്പിൾ വാക്കാണ്. And she took almost 10 to 15 minutes explaining the word verbally, when all she could have done is, she could have just simply crouched on the floor and demonstrated it to them. So after the class, I asked her what had actually happened and why is it that you never demonstrated crouch to the students. She said it feels very awkward. Probably it does. I agree. But again, like, the act of demonstration saves you a lot of time, and it saves you a lot of energy. And again, like, the kind of impact that it can have on your students is, again, terrific. So yeah, let's try out that as well. The act of demonstration, the skill of demonstration. And there's something called the skill of closure, which is, again, as important as the skill of introduction. It's just not enough that you sort of introduce the lesson brilliantly, you came up with brilliant explanations. You need to sort of end it beautifully as well, right? So, and that is what the skill of closure is all about, because it's very essential. It's very essential in the sense that introducing a topic might be very easy, but the skill of closure is not as easy as introducing a topic. That's, again, it could be sometimes very tricky, because teachers should ensure that they are closing the topic systematically, they are closing the topic clearly, and you would give them assignments probably for closure, or you could ensure through other methods, that whatever they have learned in the class is retained properly. The focus is almost always on retention when it comes to closure. So again, that's, again, a very important skill. And the last one, the final micro teaching skill that we'll be talking about today, is something called the skill of using ICT. Again, this is a skill that has been very recently added to the micro teaching list. And if you ask me, earlier we used to have a skill of using teaching aids in the micro teaching list, but today we have come to a point, where almost all teaching aids have been replaced by ICT tools, right? So again, the skill of using ICT has absolutely replaced the skill of using mere teaching aids. And it's all about, establishing a basic technical know-how of how technological gadgets work and how they could be used in the classroom and how they could be used for different linguistic purposes. What are the appropriate tech aids that I can use in the classroom, and for what purpose can I use them? And I also need to be concerned about the constant upgradation, that is very much essential when it comes to using technology in the classes. So isn't that very simple? I mean, these are the basic 10 micro teaching skills that we need to be familiar with. And is it all? No. We need to be even more concerned about something called the micro teaching cycle. Now, this is what the micro teaching cycle is all about. And when it comes to your examination, you're going to be asked what micro teaching is, what are the different kinds of micro teaching skills, and what is a micro teaching skill all about. So this is what the micro teaching cycle is all about. This is the micro teaching process, for that matter. And any micro teaching cycle or any micro teaching process, in fact, consists of 6 basic steps. So when you take a look at the graphic on the screen, you can very quickly understand that you start with something called planning, then you move on to something called teaching, then you move further ahead to feedback, to replanning, reteaching, and re-feedback. So these are the 6 steps that are involved in micro teaching. Of course, we need to take a look at what each of these steps specifically mean. The first one is planning. So how do you actually plan a micro teaching lesson? In fact, the first step, in fact, involves a further few sub-steps. Planning is something that involves a further few sub-steps, and planning, the very first thing that you do when it comes to planning is defining the skill that you're going to practice. Now, how would you define the skill? You would clearly identify what the skill is all about. You would clearly identify what are the subcomponents that make up the skill. And, that's how you define the skill. So the skill is there and the subcomponents are there. So defining the skill. And then you might be provided with different demonstrations of the skill, demonstrations that have been done by experts, for instance, or demonstrations that have been done by teachers. Like, for instance, if you're looking for micro teaching demonstrations, you could just do a very random search on YouTube, and you would come up with any number of micro teaching video demonstrations. So you go through all these demonstrations and you familiarize yourself with this particular skill that you're going to practice. So watching demonstrations, and then finally what you do is you design the lesson itself. Now, what do you mean by designing the lesson? There's a small micro teaching lesson plan that you need to prepare for practicing the micro teaching skill. So you design this particular lesson. So first of all, you define the skill, you decide what subcomponents of the skill are going to be. Then you watch different demonstrations of the demonstration videos of this micro teaching skill in practice that has been put up by experts, educators, and then finally you design the micro teaching lesson itself. This is what the first step is all about. So this is what planning is all about. The second step is something called teaching. Now, this is where the actual fun starts. And the student teacher, what he or she does is she teaches the lesson to a small group of students. As I said, there's a scale down. It's scale down teaching. So the number of students has been scaled down to sort of 5 to 10 max. So you have a very small group of 5 students or maximum 10 students sitting in front of you, and you're teaching this particular skill to the students. You're not teaching the skill per se. I mean, you're teaching a concept, you're teaching an idea, but then you're practicing the skill through the teaching of this concept or idea. And this lesson, while you're teaching, the lesson is observed by your supervisor teacher. This lesson might be observed by your peers, your colleagues, your classmates, and probably this lesson might even be observed by the rest of the students in the class who are sitting outside, And again, this lesson can be audio taped, it can be video taped, or it could be sort of telecast live through a CCTV network or something like that. I mean, anything is possible. The one basic thing is that it needs to be videographed. Audiographed, not so much, but videographed, yes. So this is the second phase when the actual teaching takes place. And then you move on to step 3, wherein you receive the feedback to what you have done. You have taken a class, you have sort of demonstrated a particular skill using the class, and then you are provided with feedback. Now, who provides you the feedback? The feedback is provided to you by the research supervisor or your classmates who have been sitting there, watching you in action. So in the light of what happens is, in the light of the feedback that is provided to you, further steps are sort of designed and planned. So one thing is, you could in fact, there's an alternative. You could in fact sit down with your research supervisor and your colleagues, and you could see the video tape together, and then you can have a productive discussion in which your supervisor and your students point out what all needs to be improved, or what are the sparkling revelations that you have come up with with regard to this particular skill, and so on. So both your negatives and positives could be exposed and explored through this feedback session. So that is feedback. And then you have the next 3 steps following immediately. I mean, in the light of the discussions and the suggestions that have been provided to you, what you can do is you can replan the whole session. You can replan the session itself, and you could use new teaching aids, or you could pay attention to something that you have missed out on during the previous session. You could sort of get over, all the, I mean, in order to ensure that, all the criticisms that have been leveled to you are sort of, so that is something that you can do. Again, you can replan the whole session, and then you can reteach it. Now, the revised lesson is, again, it is retaught to another small group of students, not the same group, preferably another small group of students of the same class, for the same duration, and to practice the same skill again. So So there's replanning and there's reteaching, and the final step is again re-feedback. Now by re-feedback, again, like the reteaching is again followed by discussion and feedback, just as we had done earlier. So this is what it's all about. It's quite simple. There's nothing, absolutely nothing complicated about the micro teaching cycles. You start with planning, and then you teach something, and then you receive the feedback for the session, then you replan, reteach, and there's a re-feedback again. It's as simple as that. Now, the steps that we have just now discussed, in fact, have been included under 3 phases. I mean, you need to clearly differentiate between the 6 steps of micro teaching and the 3 phases of micro teaching. I mean, these are like slightly different in the sense, the steps that we have already discussed are included under 3 major heads, which in fact fall under this all-encompassing term called micro teaching phases. So we need to clearly differentiate between steps and phases. So these are the 3 phases of micro teaching. The first one is knowledge acquisition, the second one is skill acquisition, and the third one is transfer phase. So let's also take a quick look at what these 3 phases are, and we have almost come to the end of the session. So the first one is again like knowledge acquisition. Just give me 1 second. My screen is sort of okay. Knowledge acquisition, and when you think of the knowledge acquisition phase, it's all about understanding the skill. So if you're sort of planning to practice the questioning skill, what is the questioning skill all about? What are the subcomponents and all that? I have to clearly understand what are the subcomponents, component skills that make up the questioning skill and all that. I could read further on this particular skill. I could read a lot of literature. I could go and watch YouTube for videos. I could do a Google search to find out more relevant materials on the one skill that I'm going to practice, and then I can watch demonstrations also. This is again like these all came under planning in the steps. Like when we were discussing the planning step, we had discussed all this, but again, like these can be clustered together under this one major head called knowledge acquisition phase when it comes to phases of micro teaching. The second phase is something called skill acquisition. Now, when in skill acquisition, what you do is, you prepare the lesson plan, you prepare the micro teaching lesson plan, then you start practicing the lessons. Now, how do you practice the lessons? You might practice the lesson in front of a mirror, for instance, or you might practice the lesson in front of a couple of close friends. You might practice the lesson in front of your family. Yeah, so you're practicing the lessons and then you're practicing the skill. See, for instance, if you are sort of practicing the skill of writing on the blackboard, for instance, you could continuously keep on writing until you have this feeling that you have almost perfected it. So again, all this comes under skill acquisition, the skill acquisition phase. And the last phase is transfer. A transfer is actually when you teach the micro teaching, teach a content using the micro teaching skill, and this is an uncontrolled situation. Uncontrolled situation, in fact, which refers to there's no specific teacher control over the situation. You are dealing with a real group of students, so their responses, in fact, cannot be controlled at all, right? So it's an uncontrolled situation, and this is a real classroom wherein a few students have come in, maybe 4 or 5 students have come in, and you're teaching them. So this is what the transfer phase is all about. And this is where you actually learn, what your strong points are and what your setbacks are. And this is where you actually grow as well as a teacher, perfecting the skills that you are trying to brush up and refine even further. So these are the 3 phases of micro teaching that we need to be familiar with. And like I have a couple of slides, explaining what it is that makes micro teaching different from ordinary teaching. Again, this is something we have already discussed in the previous slide, but we'll take a quick look. The first one is micro teaching. When it comes to micro teaching, the objectives of micro teaching are always in behavioral terms. Now, what do you mean by behavioral terms? Behavioral terms, in fact, like all the objectives in micro teaching are listed in terms of teacher behavior. The teacher presents an example. The teacher writes on the blackboard. The teacher asks a question. The teacher winds up the session. So it's all about teacher behavior. Whereas in ordinary teaching, it's not the case at all. It's about general objectives, right? So that is one major difference. And again, in micro teaching, it's a class of 5 to 10 students, whereas in ordinary teaching, these could be huge classrooms with any number of students. Micro teaching, you're focusing on one skill at a time, whereas in ordinary teaching, you're juggling with multiple skills at a time, right? Several skills are in action all the time. And when it comes to micro teaching, it is 5 to 10 minutes duration of class, whereas non-ordinary teaching, it's usually 45 minutes. Sometimes it might be 1 hour or probably even longer. In micro teaching, there's an immediate feedback that is available, whereas in ordinary teaching, immediate feedback need not always be available. There are at least a few classroom situations in which, immediate feedback is not provided. So that is one problem. In micro teaching, it's a control situation. In ordinary teaching, it's often uncontrolled, uncontrolled in the sense like there's absolutely no control over the audience at all. But in micro teaching, at least a few facts are controlled. Like you are precisely deciding what is the level of perfection that you need to attain when it comes to the teaching skill and like multiple things. And teaching is relatively simple in micro teaching because this is a very small session, just around 5 to 10 minutes, and you're focusing on one skill, and the concept or content that you're going to teach is like very small. So it's, again, teaching is not a very complex process. But in ordinary teaching, it is much more complex. You're dealing with multiple skills, and you're dealing with a much larger group of students. And then finally, in micro teaching, there's total focus on the skill, whereas ordinary teaching, the focal points would be on multiple factors, not necessarily on the skill alone. You'll be focusing on the content, you'll be focusing on the skills, you'll be focusing on your students, you'll be focusing on several other things, including curricular and non-curricular activities even. So these are the basic differences when it comes to micro teaching and ordinary teaching. Before we wind up, I thought I'd sort of present you at least one example of how a micro teaching lesson plan actually looks like. Now, if you analyze a micro teaching lesson plan, it's not really that as much complicated as an ordinary lesson plan. I mean, it's not that lengthy as well. It's a very small lesson plan because, again, the focus is on one small skill. The micro teaching lesson plan, the one that is usually followed in English classrooms, consists of 3 components, 3 major parts, in fact. And the first one is where this is the first part that you see on screen right now. And the first part is where you explain what is the skill that you're going to practice, one, and what are the subcomponents or what are the component skills that make up this particular skill. For example, I have taken up the skill of explaining here. And the components of the skill of explaining have been clearly, identified, and they have been laid down: beginning statement, explaining links, concluding statement, and questions to test pupils' understanding. And in the lesson plan, you can even point out a few things that you should not be doing while practicing this skill. And those have been included under the title don'ts. So irrelevant statements should be avoided. Lacking in continuity, again, no. And finally, vague words and phrases must be avoided while explaining something. So these are the 3 things that you need to keep in mind when it comes to explaining. And the components of the skill have also been clearly identified. So this is the first part of the lesson plan, wherein you identify the skill, the subcomponents of the component skills, and then finally you also clearly understand what should not be done. And you clearly state it down. That's the first part. Part 2 is the actual the lesson plan. The lesson plan in the sense like it's the format of the lesson plan, which looks quite similar to the normal lesson plan that you have been writing otherwise. It's quite similar to the normal prose or poetry lesson. The only thing is that this is 3 major columns. If you do not take into account the serial number column, you have 3 major columns, and in the first column you have the heading called teacher activity. In the second column, you have the subsequent, or the corresponding pupil activity. And in the last column, you have something called the skill component. So when it comes to the skill of explaining, again, what happens is, the teacher activity, the teacher begins by a statement about the color green. Green is a color that oozes positivity and stands for nature, fresh beginnings, and growth. So this is what the teacher activity is all about. And this is how the class starts. And then pupil activity, they listen attentively to whatever the teacher is telling them. And the skill component that has been identified is beginning statement. So if you go back to the previous slide, you need to have teacher activities for explaining links. You need to have teacher activities for concluding statements. And you need to have teacher activities for questions to test pupils' understanding. And for each of these, there would be corresponding student activities as well. So it's as simple as that, So if you have, say, 4 components of the skill, it need not necessarily always mean that, there should only be one activity for one component. Again, beginning statements could be 1 or 2 or 3. And then I could use, say, probably 4 explaining links. I could use 2 concluding statements. And then finally, I could ask 1 question. The only thing is the time frame should be limited to a maximum of 10 minutes, 5 to 10 minutes maximum. So this is how you write the micro teaching lesson plan. And the last part of the lesson plan is something called the observation schedule. Now, what do you mean by the observation schedule? The observation schedule is something that every participant in the micro teaching learning process, in fact, every viewer should have a copy of the observation schedule with him or her. And once the micro teaching process is done, this is how you provide them the feedback. So if I have been watching an observation lesson, if I have been watching a micro teaching lesson, then I need to fill up this observation schedule. This observation schedule, wherein the details of the student teacher, the name of the supervisor needs to be entered, subject, class, date, time, and topic. I need to specify if this is a teach session or a reteach session. ആദ്യത്തെ ഒരു ഭാഗത്തിൽ വന്ന ഒരു ടീച്ച് സെഷൻ ആയിരുന്നു, അതോ രണ്ടാമത് നമ്മൾ ഫീഡ്ബാക്ക് കഴിഞ്ഞിട്ട് വീണ്ടും ഒരു പ്രാവശ്യം കൊണ്ട് നടത്തിയ റീടീച്ച് സെഷൻ ആയിരുന്നു എന്നുള്ളത് നമ്മളിവിടെ ക്ലിയർ കട്ട് ആയിട്ട് ഒരു ടിക്ക് മാർക്കോ എന്തെങ്കിലും ഇട്ട് സ്റ്റേറ്റ് ചെയ്യണം. And then all skill components have been identified. Each of these skill components have been identified, right? So beginning statement, explaining links, concluding statement, and questions to test understanding. ഇതിലിപ്പോ ആ ലെസൺ പ്ലാനിൽ നമുക്ക് എല്ലാം കൂടെ ഒരു 8 സ്റ്റേറ്റ്മെന്റ്സ് ആയിരുന്നു ഉണ്ടായിരുന്നെങ്കിൽ, അല്ലെങ്കിൽ 8 കോമ്പണൻസ് ആയിരുന്നു ഉണ്ടായിരുന്നെങ്കിൽ, ആ 8 എണ്ണത്തിനെയും നമുക്ക് ഇവിടെയും ലിസ്റ്റ് ചെയ്യാവുന്നതാണ്. And then as an observer, you need to grade it. Now, how do you grade it? താഴെ ഒരു കുഞ്ഞു സ്റ്റാർ ഇട്ടിട്ട് it has been given as a footer statement. Grade the attainment of the skill component across 5 grades: A, B, C, D, and E. A standing for excellent and E standing for poor. So if you feel that the beginning statement was excellent, you can grade it A. If you feel that it was not up to the mark, you could give it a C. If you believe that it was absolutely off the mark, you would give it an E. So again, and you could even sort of jot down the remarks at the side. So this is how the observation schedule looks like, since these are the 3 components that make up the micro teaching lesson plan. So first of all, you have, we'll quickly take a look at it once again, and this is the last frame that I have for you. Yeah. So first of all, you have the particular skill, the components of the skill, and what should not be done. That is clearly stated. The second part is all about the real lesson plan as such, which comprises of teacher activity, student activity, and the skill component. And the third part is all about the observation schedule, wherein you rate the individual components based on the performance that you have just observed. So that's about it. And last but certainly not the least, I have one more final quote for you, which is a very famous quote by Jodi Picoult. And she says that the fact that you worry about being a good teacher means that you're already one. Isn't that a wonderful statement? In fact, because going back to the initial scores that you have jotted down on the paper, if you're one of those people who have made an average score, Jodi Picoult has this wonderful statement for you. If you're an average scorer, I mean, it means that you worry about being a good teacher, and you're already one. So isn't that wonderful? Now, even if you have scored 100%, don't worry at all, because you could only go further up the ladder. So no worries. Thank you so much for a very, very patient listening. I think I've taken just about 55 minutes. So and thanks for the wonderful turnout. It feels so good to be here and to be interacting with you. I am open to discussion, and I'm open to questions if you have any. Thank you so much.
Okay, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Now it's a time to clear the doubts. Participants can ask questions if you can any. You can also make use of the chat box.
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon, Aparna.
Sir, actually, it's a wonderful section. Sir, I would like to say something that how can we create some positive learning environment in order to capture the students for in order to make a good beginning.
How could you create a positive learning environment? Is that what you're asking me?
Yes, yes, sir. Yes.
Okay. That's again a very tricky question, Aparna. It's not something that happens overnight, if you ask me. I mean, you can't possibly create a positive learning environment overnight. The only thing that you could possibly do is to spread lots of positivity around so that students have a good example to emulate. I mean, you look up to your teacher and see that he is a good example of spreading lots of positivity around. So let me be a little bit positive as well. Smiles are the most contagious things in the world. The other person is forced to smile back at you, right? So that's probably the only way in which you can do that. You can't sort of inject positivity into someone. നമുക്കൊരു ഒരേ ഒരു കാര്യം ചെയ്യാമെന്ന് വെച്ചാൽ എല്ലാവരും നോക്കി ചിരിക്കുക, സന്തോഷമായിട്ടൊക്കെ ഇരിക്കുക, കുറച്ച് പോസിറ്റിവിറ്റി ഒക്കെ തിരിച്ചു വരുമെന്ന് പ്രതീക്ഷിക്കുക. അതാണ് ചെയ്യാവുന്നത്. Rather than sort of teach them positivity.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
Any other doubts? Okay, sir. We can move on to the vote of thanks section. For that, I invite Ms. Rakhi, student of First B.Ed English, KU City, Nadamangar, to deliver the vote of thanks.
Good evening, honorable chief guests, respected principal, teachers, and my dear students. I am bestowed with the duty to express vote of thanks today. First of all, I would like to thank our principal, Dr. Kumar sir, for giving us all the support and also organizing webinars for students. Next, I would like to thank our chief guest, Velayudhan Nair. Sir, your class was very informative and illuminating, and I thank you on behalf of all the participants for sparing some time for us in your busy schedule to teach us. And I would like to thank the teacher on behalf of me and KUCT Nadamangar. Thank you all other teachers, thank participants. Once again, thank you all. And one thing, the link for e-certificate will be shared in the chat box. All participants are requested to kindly fill the form in order to get their certificates, and thank you all.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Okay.
Thank you. Nitiri sir, thank you. Chancel sir, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.